The storm before the break. The day began like any other for Sergeant Elijah McCall, a decorated soldier who had given his life to serve his country with honor and dignity. Elijah, a man of unwavering principles, prided himself on the discipline and resilience that years of service had instilled in him. But beneath the surface, Elijah was also a devoted father and widower, a man whose every decision was driven by the love he held for his teenage daughter, Amara. Amara, now 16, was the light of Elijah's life. Her laughter filled their small home with warmth, even in the coldest of seasons. Elijah often marveled at her strength. Losing her mother at a young age hadn't dimmed her spirit, only sharpened her determination. She was his anchor, his reason to keep pushing through the struggles that life threw at him. But on this particular day, as Elijah stepped onto a plane bound for a military conference in Dallas, he couldn't have known his life was about to take a dramatic turn. Elijah boarded the flight, dressed in his crisp uniform, medals displayed neatly on his chest. Heads turned as he passed through the narrow aisle. Some passengers nodded in respect, while others murmured in admiration. However, not everyone shared the sentiment. A man seated in first class glanced up from his newspaper, his face contorting into a scowl. His name was Charles Reynolds, a businessman known for his blunt demeanor and a prejudice he no longer cared to hide. Charles watched Elijah with disdain, muttering under his breath loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Why do they let people like him sit up here?" he sneered, loud enough to turn heads. Elijah paused mid-step, his calm brown eyes locking onto Charles. He'd faced prejudice before, on the battlefield and at home. It no longer shocked him, but it always stung. Ignoring the man, Elijah moved to his assigned seat. As he settled in, he couldn't help but notice Charles continuing his tirade, this time directed at the flight attendant. "Why don't you seat people like him in the back where they belong?" Charles barked. The young flight attendant froze, clearly caught off guard. She cast an apologetic glance at Elijah, who simply gave her a reassuring nod. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice steady. "I've dealt with worse." But the murmurs among the passengers grew louder, some visibly uncomfortable with the growing tension. Elijah remained calm, his military training kicking in. He focused on the reason he was here, the conference, his duty, and his promise to be back home in time for Amara's debate tournament. As the flight took off, Charles continued to fume, making snide remarks about Elijah whenever the opportunity arose. Elijah ignored him, choosing to focus on a small photograph he kept in his wallet. It was of Amara, her radiant smile a beacon of hope amidst the storm brewing around him. "Do you have something to say to me, sir?" Elijah finally asked, his voice firm but devoid of anger. Charles turned toward him, smirking. "Just wondering how someone like you gets to wear that uniform, that you haven't earned half those medals." A gasp rippled through the cabin. The tension was palpable. Elijah straightened, his voice unwavering. "Every medal I wear represents the sacrifices my brothers and sisters in arms have made. Some of them never came home. I wear this uniform to honor them." Charles rolled his eyes. "Spare me the sob story." The other passengers were visibly uncomfortable. A woman seated nearby whispered, "Someone needs to report him." But Elijah held up a hand, signaling that he didn't need anyone to intervene. As the plane began its descent, Elijah hoped that would be the end of it. But as passengers filed out of the aircraft, Charles stood by the exit, blocking Elijah's path. "You're nothing but a fraud," Charles spat. "Men like you don't belong in positions of honor." Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his towering presence making Charles take a step back. "And men like you," Elijah said, his voice low but commanding, "don't get to decide who's worthy of respect. Now, if you'll excuse me." He walked past Charles without another word, his back straight, his dignity intact. The following day, Charles' world was turned upside down. Charles, a man who prided himself on keeping up with current events, sipped his coffee while flipping through the news. He nearly choked when a headline caught his eye. Local hero saves lives during tragic apartment fire. The article featured none other than Sergeant Elijah McCall. The story detailed how Elijah, on his way home from the airport, had run into a burning building to rescue 3 children trapped inside. Despite the intense heat and smoke, Elijah had carried them to safety, refusing medical attention for his burns until every child was accounted for. Charles read on, his hands trembling. The article described Elijah's military career in glowing terms: a Bronze Star recipient, a mentor to younger soldiers, and a man widely respected in his community for his volunteer work with at-risk youth. Charles felt a lump form in his throat as he scrolled through the accompanying video. There was Elijah, standing outside the charred remains of the apartment building, his uniform soot-stained, his face weary but resolute. When asked why he risked his life, Elijah had replied simply, "Because it's my duty. It's who I am." Charles' mind raced as guilt consumed him. He recalled every word he'd hurled at Elijah on the plane, every insult, every baseless accusation. Shame burned through him as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. A public apology. Charles Reynolds sat in his office the next morning, staring at the newspaper article that had haunted him since he read it. The photo of Sergeant Elijah McCall rescuing children from a burning building was seared into his memory. The words beneath the image described Elijah as a hero, protector, and a man of unyielding courage. The contrast between the man in the article and the man Charles had insulted on the plane was stark. Charles felt a knot of shame tightening in his chest. His words, vile, cutting, baseless, echoed in his mind, each one a painful reminder of his own arrogance. He couldn't deny it any longer. He had been wrong. His assistant knocked softly on the door, breaking his thoughts. "Mr. Reynolds," she said hesitantly, "you have a full schedule today. Should I prepare the reports for your morning meeting?" Charles waved her off. "Cancel it. I have something more important to take care of." The first step toward atonement wasn't easy. Charles knew an apology wouldn't erase the damage he'd done, but it was a start. He picked up the phone and called the local news station that had covered Elijah's story. After a few inquiries, he obtained the address of the fire station where Elijah volunteered. Charles wasn't sure what he'd say or if Elijah would even listen. All he knew was that he needed to face the man he had wronged. That afternoon, Charles arrived at the fire station, feeling out of place among the trucks and the bustling firefighters. He scanned the area until his eyes landed on Elijah, who stood by a group of children, helping them try on miniature firefighter helmets as part of a community outreach program. The children laughed, their faces lighting up as Elijah patiently showed them how to operate a small hose. The sight tugged at Charles' heart. This was a man of character, someone who embodied the very values Charles had dismissed. Guilt weighed heavier on him with every step he took toward Elijah. Elijah noticed Charles before he spoke. His expression was unreadable, his posture calm but alert. "You're the last person I expected to see here," Elijah said evenly, his voice devoid of malice but firm. Charles swallowed hard. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I needed to see you, to apologize." Elijah crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Apologize for what, exactly?" Charles looked down, ashamed. "For what I said to you on the plane. For judging you without knowing a thing about you. I made assumptions, and I said things that were cruel and uncalled for. I was wrong." Elijah studied him for a long moment. "And why are you apologizing now? Did something happen to change your mind?" Charles hesitated before pulling the newspaper from his briefcase. He held it out to Elijah, who glanced at it briefly before looking back at Charles. "I saw what you did," Charles admitted. "The fire, the children. I read about your service, your life. I realized that I treated you unfairly. You didn't deserve that." Elijah's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained steady. "You're right. I didn't deserve that. But this isn't about me. This is about you. Why did you say those things in the first place?" The question cut deeper than Charles expected. He had spent his life building a successful career, climbing the corporate ladder, and asserting dominance in every room he entered. But this moment wasn't about power or control. It was about accountability. "I've been ignorant," Charles admitted. "I've let my own biases dictate how I see people. I've been wrong more times than I can count. But seeing what kind of man you are, made me realize I need to change. I want to be better." Elijah nodded slowly, as if weighing the sincerity of Charles' words. Finally, he extended a hand. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. I hope you mean what you say." Charles shook Elijah's hand, a sense of relief washing over him. "I do. And I want to do more than just apologize." True to his word, Charles didn't let his apology end with a handshake. He threw himself into supporting the causes Elijah held dear. He donated to the outreach programs Elijah was involved in, ensuring that at-risk youth had access to resources and mentorship. He used his platform as a businessman to advocate for greater respect and support for veterans. And most importantly, he began to examine his own biases, challenging himself to grow beyond them. For Elijah, life carried on as usual. He continued to serve his community, mentor young people, and above all, be there for his daughter, Amara. But something about Charles' apology stuck with him. It wasn't often that someone like Charles took accountability for their actions, and Elijah couldn't help but wonder if it might lead to a ripple effect of positive change. One evening, as Elijah prepared dinner, Amara approached him with her usual curiosity. "Dad," she began, "what's that guy from the news doing helping with our community programs? I thought he was just some rich CEO." Elijah chuckled, setting down the knife he was using to chop vegetables. "That rich CEO made some mistakes, Amara, but he's trying to make things right. Sometimes people just need a chance to prove they can change." Amara tilted her head, considering his words. "Do you believe him?" "I believe actions speak louder than words," Elijah said. "And so far, his actions are saying a lot." Amara smiled, her admiration for her father clear. "You're a good man, Dad. I'm glad other people are starting to see that too." Elijah ruffled her hair, his heart swelling with pride. "Thanks, sweetheart. That means more than you know." As the weeks turned into months, Charles and Elijah found themselves working together more frequently. What began as an effort to make amends blossomed into an unlikely partnership. Together, they organized community events, raised funds for veterans, and advocated for systemic change. Through their work, Charles learned what it truly meant to serve others. He saw the sacrifices Elijah and his fellow soldiers had made, the challenges they faced even after returning home, and the strength it took to keep going despite it all. For the first time in his life, Charles felt a sense of purpose beyond his own ambitions. Elijah, too, found something unexpected in their partnership. He saw a man who was willing to confront his own flaws and work tirelessly to make amends. It reminded him that change was possible, even for those who seemed least likely to embrace it. Building bridges. Elijah McCall never thought he would be working side by side with a man like Charles Reynolds. Yet there they were, standing together in front of a crowd of local community members gathered for an outreach event at the fire station. The event was designed to connect veterans with job opportunities, mental health resources, and mentorship programs. It was the kind of initiative that Elijah had long championed. But this time, he wasn't doing it alone. Charles had thrown his full support behind the event, using his resources and connections to bring in sponsors and volunteers. He even brought his business expertise to streamline the logistics, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. For a man who once seemed to personify arrogance, Charles now worked with humility and determination. It was clear he was genuinely committed to the cause. As Elijah addressed the crowd, his voice steady and filled with conviction, Charles stood beside him, handing out flyers and speaking with attendees. The juxtaposition wasn't lost on Elijah. He had witnessed Charles' transformation firsthand, and while he remained cautious, he couldn't deny the progress the man had made. One of the attendees, a young veteran named Malik, approached Elijah after the event. Malik was in his early 20s, his posture slouched under the weight of invisible burdens. His eyes carried the telltale signs of sleepless nights and battles fought both abroad and within. "Sergeant McCall," Malik said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you. For this, for everything. It's hard to feel like anyone cares once you're out." Elijah placed a reassuring hand on Malik's shoulder. "You're not alone, Malik. We've all been through it, and we're here to help. What do you need?" Malik glanced at Charles, who stood a few feet away, speaking animatedly to a group of sponsors. "That guy. He's a businessman, right? What's he doing here?" Elijah smiled. "Charles is learning. He's made mistakes, but he's working to make up for them. Give him a chance. You might be surprised." Malik nodded slowly. "If he's working with you, that's good enough for me." Later that evening, as the event wrapped up, Elijah and Charles sat together on the tailgate of a fire truck. The crowd had dispersed, leaving behind only the quiet hum of crickets and the faint glow of streetlights. Charles wiped his brow, exhaustion evident in his posture. "That was something," Charles admitted. "I've organized plenty of events before, but none of them felt this important." Elijah glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "That's because this wasn't about you. It was about them." Charles nodded, taking the comment in stride. "You're right. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something that actually matters. And it feels different, better." Elijah studied Charles for a moment before speaking. People like Malik, they need someone to believe in them. Someone to fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. If you're serious about this, you need to remember that. "I am serious," Charles said firmly. "This isn't about my guilt anymore. It's about making a real difference." Elijah nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Then keep showing up." The partnership between Elijah and Charles began to gain attention. Local news outlets covered their events, highlighting the unlikely duo's efforts to bridge the gap between veterans and the civilian community. Their work inspired others to get involved, from small business owners to educators to local officials. One afternoon, during a planning meeting for their next initiative, Amara stopped by the fire station. She had heard about her father's work with Charles, but hadn't met him yet. As she walked in, carrying a box of snacks for the volunteers, her eyes landed on Charles. "You must be Mr. Reynolds," she said, her tone polite but curious. Charles looked up, startled. "And you must be Amara. Your dad talks about you all the time." Amara raised an eyebrow, glancing at Elijah. "Does he now?" Elijah chuckled. "Only good things, I promise." Charles extended a hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Amara. Your dad is an incredible man." Amara hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "He is, and he's a pretty good judge of character, so I guess you're all right." Charles laughed, a genuine, hearty sound. "I'll take that as a compliment." As Amara helped distribute snacks, she watched Charles interact with the volunteers. It was clear to her that he was trying, really trying. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of admiration for the man who had once insulted her father, but was now working tirelessly to support his mission. Over the next few months, their efforts expanded beyond the local community. With Charles' connections, they were able to secure funding for statewide initiatives, including scholarships for veterans and their families, mental health services, and career training programs. The impact was undeniable, and both men found themselves busier than ever. But the work wasn't without challenges. Not everyone was quick to forgive Charles' past behavior, and there were moments when his sincerity was called into question. During a town hall meeting, one attendee confronted him directly. "Why should we trust you?" the man demanded, his voice tinged with anger. "You're just another rich guy trying to ease his guilt." Charles didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze, his voice steady. "You're right to question me. I've made mistakes, more than I can count. But I'm here because I believe in what we're doing. It's not about easing my guilt. It's about doing what's right." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Elijah stepped forward, his voice strong and commanding. Charles has shown up, day after day. He's put his money, his time, and his energy into this work. Actions speak louder than words, and his actions have earned my trust. That should count for something. The crowd murmured in agreement, and the tension eased. Elijah's endorsement carried weight, and it was clear that Charles had made significant progress in earning the community's trust. As their partnership grew, so did their friendship. Elijah began to see Charles not just as a man seeking redemption, but as someone genuinely committed to change. And Charles saw Elijah as more than a hero. He was a mentor, a guide, and a reminder of the strength it took to persevere. One evening, as they prepared for another event, Charles turned to Elijah. "You know, if someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be doing this, I would have laughed in their face." Elijah smirked. Life has a funny way of humbling us. Charles nodded. "It does, and I'm grateful for it. Working with you has taught me more than I ever thought possible." Elijah placed a hand on Charles' shoulder. "You've come a long way, Charles, but the work doesn't stop here. There's still more to do." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Charles said with a smile. The road to redemption. The work was far from over. As the partnership between Elijah McCall and Charles Reynolds grew, so did the scope of their mission. What began as a local initiative to support veterans had now gained traction on a national level. Invitations poured in for them to speak at conferences, appear on talk shows, and share their story with audiences far and wide. For Elijah, it was an opportunity to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. For Charles, it was a chance to continue proving he was a changed man. But with success came scrutiny. One cold January morning, Elijah and Charles found themselves in Washington, D.C., preparing to present their case to a congressional committee. Their goal was ambitious: to secure federal funding for a nationwide program aimed at providing mental health resources, job training, and housing assistance for veterans. The committee chamber was imposing, with its high ceilings and rows of stern-faced lawmakers. Elijah stood at the podium, his military bearing evident in every word he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elijah began, his voice steady, "when we ask men and women to serve their country, we make a promise to stand by them when they return. But too often, that promise is broken. Veterans struggle to reintegrate into society, facing unemployment, homelessness, and mental health challenges. This program isn't just a solution, it's a responsibility." Charles, seated beside Elijah, watched him with admiration. When it was his turn to speak, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I won't pretend I have all the answers," Charles admitted, his voice more vulnerable than usual. "But I've seen firsthand the impact of neglecting those who've given everything for us. It's easy to turn a blind eye until someone like Sergeant McCall shows you the truth. This isn't about politics. It's about humanity." As they concluded their presentation, the room erupted in applause from the audience, though the lawmakers remained reserved. Elijah and Charles knew they had planted a seed, but the fight was far from won. Outside the chamber, reporters swarmed them with questions. Some praised their efforts, while others were less kind. "Mr. Reynolds," one reporter called out, "how do you respond to critics who say your involvement is just a PR stunt?" Charles stiffened but forced a calm response. "I don't blame people for being skeptical. My past behavior warrants it, but this isn't about me. It's about the veterans who need our help. Judge me by my actions, not my words." Elijah placed a hand on Charles' shoulder, a silent show of support. "We're not here to argue with critics," Elijah said firmly. "We're here to make a difference." Back at their hotel, Charles slumped onto the couch, exhaustion etched into his features. "That reporter wasn't wrong," he muttered. "There's still a part of me that wonders if I'll ever be more than the man I used to be." Elijah sat across from him, his expression thoughtful. "Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about what you do with the lessons it taught you. You're not that man anymore, Charles. You've proven that. Charles nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. Sometimes it feels like I'll never be enough. You're enough when you keep showing up, Elijah said. And you've been doing that every single day. Their efforts soon faced another hurdle. While many supported their mission, others saw it as a threat to the status quo. A prominent lobbying group opposed their program, arguing that private organizations were better suited to handle veterans' needs. The pushback was fierce, and both Elijah and Charles became targets of a smear campaign. Headlines accused Charles of using the initiative to repair his public image, while others questioned Elijah's motives, digging into his personal life for any sign of controversy. The negativity was relentless, but Elijah remained steadfast. We knew this wouldn't be easy, Elijah told Charles during a late-night strategy meeting. The more impact we make, the harder some people will push back. We just have to push harder. Charles, however, struggled with the weight of the attacks. I can handle people coming after me, he said, but seeing them drag you into it, your service, your integrity, it's infuriating. Elijah's gaze was calm but resolute. My integrity doesn't come from their opinions. It comes from what I know to be true. Let them say what they want. We stay focused. Amid the chaos, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Malik, the young veteran Elijah had mentored, stepped forward to share his story. During a televised interview, Malik spoke passionately about how Elijah and Charles' program had changed his life. I was at rock bottom, Malik said, his voice trembling with emotion. I didn't think anyone cared if I lived or died. But these two men, they didn't just talk about helping. They showed up. They gave me hope when I had none. And now, I'm back on my feet because of them. The interview went viral, sparking a wave of public support. Thousands of veterans and their families shared similar stories, flooding social media with messages of gratitude and solidarity. The tide began to turn in their favor. One evening, as Elijah and Charles prepared for another round of meetings, Amara surprised them by stopping by their office. She carried a folder filled with handwritten letters from veterans who had benefited from their program. Dad, you need to see this, she said, her eyes shining with pride. People are listening. They're finally seeing what you've been fighting for. Elijah flipped through the letters, his chest swelling with emotion. This is why we do it, he said softly. Charles leaned over to read one of the letters, a smile breaking through his tired expression. Looks like the critics are outnumbered. Amara grinned. I'd say so. The momentum they gained from the public support propelled their initiative forward. Congress approved partial funding for their program, and several states pledged additional resources to expand its reach. It was a hard-fought victory, but Elijah and Charles knew it was only the beginning. Standing together at a press conference announcing the program's launch, Elijah addressed the crowd with a mixture of gratitude and determination. This isn't about two men or one program, he said. It's about honoring a promise we made to every veteran who served. It's about showing them that they matter, that their sacrifices weren't in vain. And this is just the start. Charles followed, his voice filled with conviction. I've made mistakes in my life, but working on this program has shown me what's truly important. It's not about redemption, it's about responsibility. And I'm honored to be part of this journey. As the applause filled the air, Elijah and Charles exchanged a look of mutual respect. Their journey wasn't over, but together they had proven that change was possible, that even the most unlikely alliances could make a difference. The weight of legacy. Months passed since the launch of the nationwide Veteran Support Program, and its impact was undeniable. Veterans across the country began to find hope in places that had long felt barren. Job placement rates soared, mental health services saw record levels of engagement, and hundreds of families were reunited with their loved ones who had once been lost to despair. But success brought a new kind of pressure for Elijah McCall and Charles Reynolds. The more they accomplished, the higher the expectations grew. Both men found themselves navigating challenges they hadn't anticipated, not just from the outside world, but within themselves. Elijah sat in his modest kitchen one quiet evening, sipping coffee as he stared at the stack of letters on the table. They were from veterans and their families, each one filled with gratitude for the program that had saved them. Yet, for every letter of thanks, Elijah couldn't help but think about the veterans they hadn't reached yet, the ones still struggling, still waiting for a lifeline. Amara walked into the room, her expression one of quiet concern. "Dad, you've been sitting there for hours. What's on your mind?" Elijah looked up, a weary smile on his face. "Just thinking about how much more there is to do. For every Malik we've helped, there are dozens more who still need us." Amara sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. "You've done so much already. You can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Elijah reached out and squeezed her hand. "It's not about carrying the weight, sweetheart. It's about making sure no one else has to carry it alone." Amara nodded, understanding the depth of her father's conviction. "Just don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You can't help anyone if you're running on empty." Meanwhile, Charles faced his own struggles. His transformation from a self-centered businessman to a dedicated advocate had garnered both praise and scrutiny. While many admired his commitment, there were still those who doubted his sincerity. The pressure to constantly prove himself began to take its toll. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with potential donors, Charles found himself alone in his office, staring at the photo of his late wife that sat on his desk. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the edges of the frame. "You'd probably laugh at me right now," he said aloud, his voice tinged with self-deprecation. "I used to think I had it all figured out. And now I'm just trying to make up for everything I've done wrong." He set the photo down and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The image of Elijah, standing tall and unshaken, flashed in his mind. Charles admired his partner's steadfastness, but he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever reach that level of certainty. Their shared mission took them to a sprawling veterans center in Chicago one cold February morning. The center had recently adopted their program and was hosting a town hall for veterans to share their experiences and concerns. As Elijah and Charles sat on the stage, listening to story after story of hardship and resilience, the weight of their responsibility felt more profound than ever. One veteran, a woman named Carla, stood up to speak. Her voice trembled as she recounted her struggles with PTSD and homelessness after leaving the service. "I didn't think I'd ever find my way back," Carla said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But this program gave me a second chance. For the first time in years, I feel like I belong somewhere." The room erupted in applause, and Carla's words struck a chord with everyone present. Elijah stood and approached her, his voice steady and filled with empathy. "Carla, your story is exactly why we're here. You're proof that no one is beyond hope. Thank you for sharing your strength with us." Charles followed suit, his voice softer but no less sincere. "You inspire us to keep going, Carla. Thank you for reminding us why this work matters." After the event, Elijah and Charles sat together in a quiet corner of the center, reflecting on what they had heard. "Elijah," Charles began, his tone contemplative, "do you ever feel like we're only scratching the surface? Like no matter how much we do, it's never enough?" Elijah nodded, his gaze distant. "All the time. But it's not about fixing everything at once. It's about making a difference where we can and trusting that it adds up." Charles sighed. "I just wonder if we'll ever really be able to repay the debt we owe these people." Elijah turned to him, his expression firm. "It's not about repayment, Charles. It's about honoring their sacrifices by showing up for them. That's all we can do." The program's reach continued to expand, but so did the challenges. Bureaucratic red tape slowed progress in some regions, while funding gaps threatened the sustainability of their efforts. Elijah and Charles worked tirelessly to address these issues, often sacrificing sleep and personal time to ensure the program's success. But amidst the chaos, moments of clarity reminded them why they fought so hard. One such moment came during a surprise visit to a rural community center that had recently implemented their program. There they met a young boy named Mason, the son of a veteran who had struggled with addiction. Mason ran up to Elijah, his face beaming. "Are you the soldier my dad talks about?" Elijah crouched down to Mason's level, smiling warmly. "I might be. What does your dad say about me?" "He says you helped him get better," Mason said proudly. "And now he's teaching me how to play baseball." Elijah felt a lump form in his throat as he ruffled Mason's hair. "Your dad's the real hero, buddy. Don't forget that." Charles watched the interaction from a distance, his heart swelling with emotion. Moments like this reminded him that their work wasn't just changing lives. It was building legacies. That night, as they prepared to leave the town, Elijah and Charles shared a rare moment of quiet reflection. "You know," Charles said, staring out at the stars, "I used to think legacy was about wealth and power, about leaving your mark on the world. But now I realize it's about the lives you touch." Elijah nodded, a faint smile on his face. "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're here." Charles turned to him, his expression earnest. "I'm grateful for this partnership, Elijah. For you. I don't think I'd be the man I am today without you." Elijah met his gaze, his voice steady and sincere. "We've both grown, Charles, and we've both still got a lot of work to do." As the two men sat under the night sky, they knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but they also knew they weren't walking it alone. Together, they were building something far greater than either of them could have imagined, a legacy of hope, resilience, and redemption. The weight of legacy. The journey was far from over, and every step forward seemed to unveil a new obstacle. That evening, after visiting the rural community center, Elijah and Charles received troubling news. A major donor had pulled funding due to pressure from external groups opposing their initiative. The timing couldn't have been worse. Several programs were just gaining traction, and a funding shortfall could stall their progress. Elijah paced the small motel room they shared, his brow furrowed in thought. "This isn't just a setback, Charles. It's a direct hit. If we lose more donors, we'll have to shut down programs in at least 3 regions." Charles sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly together. "We can't let that happen. We've come too far to let politics and egos derail this. There has to be another way." Elijah stopped pacing and turned to face him. "We need to think bigger. If private donors are backing out, we'll need to rally public support. We've seen how powerful stories like Malik's and Carla's can be. We have to give the people a reason to fight for this with us." Charles nodded, determination hardening his features. "If we go public with this, we're going to face even more pushback. But I'm ready if you are." Elijah smiled faintly. "We faced worse." The next morning, Elijah and Charles began planning a nationwide awareness campaign. Their goal was to not only raise funds, but also to highlight the human stories behind their program. They reached out to veterans like Malik and Carla, asking if they would be willing to share their experiences on a larger platform. To their surprise, the response was overwhelming. Veterans from across the country volunteered to speak out, their voices forming a powerful chorus of resilience and hope. Elijah and Charles worked tirelessly to coordinate interviews, organize rallies, and create online content that could reach millions. One of the campaign's most impactful moments came during a live-streamed town hall in Atlanta. Carla took the stage alongside Elijah and Charles, her voice steady as she addressed the packed auditorium. "I used to think I was invisible," Carla said, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "But this program didn't just see me, it saved me. And it's not just me. There are thousands of us, each with a story worth hearing. We're not asking for handouts. We're asking for the chance to rebuild our lives." The audience erupted into applause, and Elijah stepped forward to speak. "This isn't about charity," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "It's about justice. It's about fulfilling the promises we made to those who served. And it's about showing the world that when we come together, We can create real, lasting change." Charles followed, his voice filled with emotion. "I stand here today not as a businessman, but as someone who has learned what it truly means to serve. And I promise you, we will not stop fighting for this cause." The town hall went viral, garnering millions of views within days. Donations poured in from individuals, organizations, and even celebrities who were moved by the campaign. The momentum was undeniable, and the program began to stabilize once more. But the success came with personal costs. Elijah and Charles found themselves stretched thin, their schedules packed with meetings, travel, and media appearances. For Elijah, it meant less time with Amara, a sacrifice that weighed heavily on him. One evening, as he returned home after a long trip, he found Amara waiting for him in the living room. She was holding a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings and photos from his campaign. "I've been keeping track of everything," Amara said with a small smile. "You're doing amazing work, Dad, but I miss you." Elijah sat beside her, guilt tugging at his heart. "I miss you too, sweetheart, more than you know." Amara leaned against him, her voice soft. "I know what you're doing is important, and I'm proud of you. Just don't forget that I need you too." Elijah kissed the top of her head, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I won't forget, Amara. I promise." For Charles, the campaign forced him to confront the lingering doubts about his worthiness. Despite the progress he had made, there were still moments when he felt like an imposter, like the man he used to be was waiting in the shadows, ready to resurface. One such moment came during a television interview when the host brought up his past. "Mr. Reynolds," the host said, "you've been open about your transformation. But how do you respond to those who say your involvement in this program is just a way to rewrite your legacy?" Charles hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice calm but firm. "I can't change the mistakes I've made, and I can't control what people think of me. But I can control what I do moving forward. This program isn't about me. It's about the veterans who deserve better. If my past makes people doubt my intentions, that's fine. I'll let my actions speak for themselves." The honesty in his response resonated with viewers, and the interview became a turning point for Charles. It was a reminder that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future worth believing in. As the campaign continued to grow, Elijah and Charles began to see the impact of their work ripple beyond the veteran community. Schools started incorporating lessons about service and sacrifice into their curriculums. Companies pledged to hire more veterans and provide support for their families. And ordinary citizens began volunteering their time and resources to make a difference. Elijah and Charles often marveled at how far they had come, from a chance meeting on a plane to leading a movement that was changing lives across the country. But they knew the journey wasn't over. One evening, as they stood together on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial after a long day of meetings in D.C., Charles turned to Elijah. "Do you ever think about how this will all end?" Charles asked, his voice reflective. Elijah looked out at the illuminated monument, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think it does end, Charles. Not for us. This is our legacy. And as long as there's work to be done, we keep going." Charles nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "Then let's make sure it's a legacy worth leaving." The triumph of legacy. The work Elijah McCall and Charles Reynolds had poured their lives into was finally bearing fruit in ways they could never have imagined. Their program, once a modest initiative, had grown into a nationwide network of support for veterans. Communities thrived, families were reunited, and veterans who once felt invisible found purpose and belonging again. Yet, as the saying goes, every great victory comes with great sacrifice. The weight of leadership. Elijah woke up to the sound of his alarm clock buzzing faintly in the early morning darkness. His days had become a blur of meetings, travel, and speeches. He barely recognized the once simpler life he had shared with his daughter, Amara. She was now preparing for college, her acceptance letters proudly pinned to the refrigerator. Though he celebrated her achievements, a pang of regret lingered in his heart. He had missed too many of her milestones. At breakfast, Elijah found Amara sitting at the table with a stack of papers in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her expression serious. "Dad," she began, "we need to talk." Elijah sat across from her, his coffee steaming between them. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Amara hesitated, then slid a brochure across the table. It was from a university just a few hours away. "I've decided to stay closer to home. I know you're busy, and I want to make sure you're okay." Elijah's chest tightened. "Amara, you don't have to do that. You've worked so hard, and you deserve to go wherever your dreams take you." Her gaze softened. "My dreams include you, Dad. I know you're doing amazing work, but I don't want us to drift apart." Elijah reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "I promise I'll do better, Amara. You've sacrificed enough because of my work. I won't let you give up your future for me." Amara smiled faintly. "Just promise me you'll be there for the big moments." "Deal." "Deal," Elijah said, his voice resolute. A ripple effect. Meanwhile, Charles faced his own struggles. Though he had earned the respect of many, there were still those who doubted his sincerity. His transformation wasn't just about proving himself to others. It was about proving himself to the man he used to be. One day, during a visit to a veterans center in Denver, Charles encountered a young woman named Kiera. She was a recent veteran, struggling to adjust to civilian life while caring for her 2 young children. She had heard of the program, but was hesitant to ask for help. "I'm not good at asking for favors," Kiera admitted as Charles sat with her in the center's modest cafeteria. "This isn't a favor," Charles said gently. "This is what you deserve. You serve your country, and now it's time for your country to serve you." Kiera's eyes filled with tears. I don't know where to start." Charles smiled warmly. "Start here. Let us help you get back on your feet. That's what this program is for." Over the next few months, Kiera's life transformed. She secured stable housing, enrolled in a job training program, and found a supportive community through the Veterans Network. At a fundraiser event later that year, she stood on stage and shared her story, her voice steady and strong. "People like Sergeant McCall and Mr. Reynolds saved my life," Kiera said. "They reminded me that I'm not alone, and that I have value. Their work doesn't just change lives, it saves them." Charles sat in the audience, her words resonating deeply. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished, not as a burden, but as a triumph, a movement beyond them. As the program's success grew, so did its influence. Local governments began adopting similar initiatives, and corporations partnered with the program to create job opportunities for veterans. The ripple effect was undeniable. One evening, Elijah and Charles were invited to speak at a gala honoring their work. The room was filled with policymakers, veterans, and supporters. As they took the stage together, the applause was deafening. Elijah spoke first, his voice calm yet powerful. "When we started this journey, we didn't know how far it would take us. But what we did know was this: no one who serves their country should ever feel abandoned. Tonight, we celebrate not just what we've accomplished, but what we've yet to achieve. This is only the beginning." Charles followed, his voice tinged with emotion. "I've spent much of my life chasing the wrong kind of success, but working alongside Elijah and meeting so many of you has shown me what true success looks like. It's not about wealth or power. It's about the lives you touch, the hope you restore, and the legacy you leave behind." As they finished, the audience rose to their feet, the standing ovation lasting several minutes. A legacy fulfilled. Years later, Elijah and Charles found themselves reflecting on their journey. The program had grown beyond their wildest dreams, with chapters in every state and partnerships across the globe. They had faced countless challenges, but they had also witnessed extraordinary triumphs. Elijah, now retired, spent more time with Amara, who had become a lawyer advocating for veterans' rights. Watching her speak passionately at a conference, Elijah felt an overwhelming sense of pride. She had inherited his determination and Charles' eloquence, becoming a beacon of hope for a new generation. Charles, too, found peace in his later years. He dedicated himself to mentoring young leaders, ensuring the program's mission would continue long after he was gone. One evening, as he sat with Elijah on a porch overlooking a quiet lake, he turned to his friend. "We did it," Charles said, his voice soft but resolute. Elijah smiled, the lines on his face deepened by years of service and sacrifice. "We did, and it was worth every moment." The two men sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared legacy settling over them like a warm blanket. They had built something that would outlive them, a testament to the power of redemption, resilience, and the unyielding belief that change was always possible.